Hello, welcome to the Patent Free Library. We are a full house tonight. If anyone is too uncomfortable, we are also projecting this onto Zoom. So you are always welcome to watch Zoom from wherever you please. If you are joining us on Zoom, welcome to you as well. This is set up as a webinar. So if you're joining us on Zoom, you won't be able to talk if you have questions, but we still welcome your questions. So you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the program when the Q&A happens. Now I'm going to turn this over to Mariah from the YMCA.
Thank you. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to welcome everybody in the room as well as those of you who are with us virtually. I'm Mariah Hope. I'm the grants manager for the YMCA as well as the staff chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So tonight's session is part of a series of DEI speaking events. And this particular set of speakers is designed to really take a look at our past, specifically in our region, and really think about the things that we sometimes would rather not think about because they can be really uncomfortable. In order to really educate ourselves about that history and create more inclusive communities as we move forward so that we can be aware of and avoid the mistakes of our past. So just a couple quick housekeeping things before we get started, and then a couple notes of gratitude. If you could please make sure that cell phones are silenced, that would be great. And then before you leave today, we just have a simple poll in the back of the room. There's a couple of sheets up on the wall, and we have some stickers. It's 2 questions, simple answers, and all you have to do is put a sticker on your answer. So if you could do that, that would be great. And that feedback is actually going to go to our funder of tonight's events, and that's Maine Humanities Council. So they have a grants program that's called Maine Speaks. And I learned about that program from one of our wonderful staff members, Jackie Stahl, who couldn't be here this evening. But she was the DEI staff chair before myself and has been a great advocate of DEI work at the Y. So when she told me about the program, I started exploring the topics and came across Malaga Island. I'm pretty new to Maine myself and wasn't familiar, found out it was right in our backyard, and really went down a rabbit hole of researching it. And I was struck by how many articles talked about how it's a history that we want to forget about and should forget about. And I thought, that is not what we need to do. We need to be aware of it and accept that that's part of our history so that we can better move forward together. So that's why I'm so glad that we're all here and that Kate is with us. I want to thank Patent Free Library and especially Hannah for getting us all set up virtually and really being a great advocate and partner in these events. And without further ado, I'll introduce Kate. So Kate McBrien currently serves as the Maine State Archivist, and she oversees the Maine State Government's archive and records management programs. She's curator of the award-winning exhibition Malaga Island, Fragmented Lives, and a historian for the Malaga Island community. She previously held positions as chief curator and director of public engagement at the Maine Historical Society and as the curator of historic collections for the Maine State Museum. Please join me in welcoming Kate McBrien.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me tonight. It's also an absolute pleasure to see so many very familiar faces in the audience, so I'm glad to see some friends here, so thank you for coming. I usually start this talk by giving a little bit of background on how I came to this position, but also how I came to the story, how I stumbled on it. I am very honored to be your Maine State Archivist. And I always say I am your state archivist because I truly work for all of you. I work for the taxpayers of Maine. I work for the citizens of Maine. And I have the honor and the pleasure to collect and preserve and make available to you the records of the Maine State Government. And I do feel that that's a very, very important role because, there it goes. Because the Maine State Archives is really critical to a transparent government. You don't know what government is doing or has done unless we have the documents and the records to show that. And it's actually those records that really helped me uncover so much of the Malaga Island story, because those records are held at the Maine State Archives. You know, the state of Maine became involved with the community who lived on Malaga Island and kept all of the records of that involvement. And it's through those records that we were able to piece out the truth, piece out what really happened to the people, but also we were able to debunk a lot of the myths that have existed for generations about the people of Malaga Island. And so that's what I want to share with you tonight. A lot of the research that I did was stemmed from an exhibition that opened up in 2012 at the Maine State Museum called Malaga Island, Fragmented Lives. That exhibit opened in 2012 because it was the centennial of the state's eviction of the Malaga Island community. 100 years. And what amazed me was that when I presented the idea for the topic, you know, I had to present it to a whole committee of these brilliant people at the State Museum, curators and scholars, and we all had to decide on an exhibit topic together. And I suggested this topic, and every single person around that table said, well, what's Malaga Island? I never heard of that. Right? And as soon as I shared the story, to their credit, every single person immediately said, oh, well, we have to do that exhibit. So we did. But then when I started to give this talk, I would always ask people in the audience, how many of you have heard of Malaga Island? So I'll ask it tonight. How many of you have heard of Malaga Island? See, I love that. Almost every single hand is raised. 10 years ago, when I asked that question, there would be like maybe 1 or 2 hands in the audience that would go up, because it was such a hidden history. It was a history that the state of Maine very purposely buried and forgot about. It was a history that the people of Phippsburg and the surrounding communities purposely stopped talking about and hid. And it was a history that the descendants of the Malaga Island community stopped talking about and purposely forgot, to the point where generations later, people had no idea that they were descended or connected to Malaga Island. So the other thing I always ask is, are there any descendants in the room with us tonight? You would be amazed how often I have asked that question from faraway states. Like I'll give a talk in New York State or Massachusetts, and there'll be someone in the audience that raises their hand. Because of course, there's hundreds of descendants now. They live all over the country. And it's wonderful. And I do try to ask, because it's really important to recognize that this story that I'm going to share with you is a story that belongs to the descendants. It's their family story, it's their family history, and it's a story that's impacted all of them and all of their lives. And I'm just the privileged historian who got to research it and share it with them and try to share it with all of you as well. So what we'll look at tonight is the history of this beautiful, beautiful island. We'll talk a bit about how the community came to live on Malaga, who these people were, what their life was like on the island, and then we'll explore how the state became involved and what led to the eviction of the community. And like I mentioned, this is Malaga Island. It's an absolutely beautiful spot at the mouth of the New Meadows River, tucked right in between the Sebasco area of Phippsburg and Bear Island. In fact, at low tide, sometimes you can actually walk in between Malaga and Bear. You know, it's very, very close. How many of you have actually been to Malaga? Also awesome. That's great. So many people, like if I asked 10 years ago, people would not raise their hands. So it's awesome to see people visiting Malaga, because it is truly such a beautiful, beautiful spot. And I love going there every time I do. It's a little bit difficult to get to, though, because you have to get yourself there. You know, like I said, it is very close to the mainland. It's not far, but there is no bridge over to the island. It's only 100 yards. So if you're really good at kayaking, you know, you can get yourself over there. The reason I really point out how close the island is to the mainland, though, is because I think it's a really important concept for everyone to wrap their heads around. That the community who ended up living on Malaga Island lived on an island that was very close and very much connected to the mainland. You know, they were not, I think when we tend to talk about island communities, we all immediately imagine something that's very isolated and something that's very secluded and removed from a larger community. And that is truly not the case with Malaga. They were only 100 yards off. They were going to the mainland on a daily basis. You could stand on like a calm day, you could stand on the shore of the mainland and holler to someone over at Malaga. You know, so it really is a very much connected to community. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we're talking about the group who lived there. So although records are not completely clear, we do know that the people who lived on Malaga all were connected in some way to one African-American man. His name was Benjamin Darling. Benjamin Darling was an African-American man formerly enslaved in South Carolina. He was owned by a sea captain out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, actually. And we don't know how, but somehow he finds his way up the Maine coast. And in 1794, Benjamin Darling purchased Horse Island, which is right next to Malaga. He purchased the island. He married a white woman in Phippsburg named Sarah Proverbs, and they raised their family on Horse Island. The Darling family actually lived there for a couple of generations. In around 1850, the island is sold. We don't really know why, but Horse Island is sold. And so his descendants, his grandchildren, scattered to nearby islands. And this was actually a really acceptable, standard, typical thing to do in the 1700s and 1800s. Islands were not really desirable places to live. I think right now, if we hear that someone's bought an island, it sounds very exclusive, right? Mm-hmm. Well, at the time, islands, you know, it was hard to live on. There's not a lot of good farming soil on a small island like this. It's only 42 acres for Malaga. So, you know, there's not a lot of use of these islands. And so if there was open available space, someone could set up a home there. Like I said, it was only 100 yards off of the mainland. Everyone knew they were there. Nobody questioned it. Nobody else was using the island. So his grandchildren just set up home there. We believe the first of the Darling descendants to set up their house on Malaga Island did so in about 1863. They set up a home on the northern end of the island. It's really the only beach area, easy place to land. So they set up their homes right there. And it started off as one family, and then like a cousin and her family came, and then a brother and his family came. And that's really how the community on Malaga Island grew. So it started in about 1863, and by 1912, it reached a total population of about 57 people. It was never huge. And there was definitely a lot of movement on and off the island. You know, one family might live there for, you know, a dozen years and then move to the mainland or come back. So it's sort of transient population. But that's generally where the community was for the period that they lived on the island. We actually know what the island looked like because it was well documented. This is actually a photo postcard of the community on Malaga Island. These are houses and boats that were used. It was documented partially because for many years, everyone knew about the community. They were really left alone to kind of do their thing. But at the end of the community's life on the island, there became a lot more talk and a lot more stories and a lot more attention paid to this group of people living on Malaga. So why all of this attention for one small island? There's many islands in this area. Why so much attention on this one? Well, this one stood out as different. It stood out as different to Maine. It stood out as different to Phippsburg. And it ended up standing out as rather different to the entire nation because it was a community of Black people and white people living together, marrying, having children. And in the late 19th, early 20th century in America, that was not widely accepted. That was seen as living outside of the norm. And so as time passed on, more attention's being paid to this community, a lot of stories began to evolve around who they were, why they were there, how they were living. Stories in Phippsburg, in Bath, up and down the Maine coast would talk about these people who were so poor, they couldn't support themselves, they couldn't feed themselves, they couldn't heat their homes. You know, they certainly couldn't educate their children. There were stories of illiteracy, inbreeding. There was actually a newspaper article I found that claimed that the children were living in tunnels and had horns growing out of their head. I mean, that's how far these crazy stories went. It also extended to the point of racist postcards that were made of the people who lived there and sold nationwide. This are two people who actually lived on Malaga. That's Elizabeth Darling and her granddaughter, Pearl Tripp. And they were purposely posed and positioned to look very scruffed and miserable and penned in like animals. And it's titled with a racist title. And this postcard can still be found in antique stores out on the West Coast. I mean, this was sold nationwide, and this became the image of Malaga Island that was shared and commonly shared amongst many people. Reality, though, was very different. This is an actual photograph of people living on Malaga Island. This is Louisa McKinney Murphy and her 3 sons sitting on their front porch with a bucket of shells, their chickens running off in the backyard. You know, you can see they're actually looking out at Sabasco from their front porch. So this is more what life was actually like, as opposed to the life that was being portrayed publicly. So how do we know that this is accurate? Well, we know from a variety of sources. We know from some of those documents that are held at the state archives, although I will say a lot of those are written with a very racist, politicized viewpoint. But a great way to really confirm if that was true or not was through the work of archaeologists. Archaeologists from the University of Southern Maine worked on Malaga Island for several years in the early 2000s so that they could really uncover at the homes of where the people of Malaga really lived. They dug at the house sites of 3 families. They dug at the McKinney house site, the Griffin house site, and the Eason house site. And the archaeologists, through those digs, were able to uncover about 50,000 artifacts. Because, of course, when you're digging at a house, especially for a house that was around in the 1800s and early 1900s, you're also digging in their trash pit. So how do we know how people live? You dig through their trash. It's a fabulous way to really uncover. And they were able to find so much about how they lived. They found utensils like spoons, forks, and knives that were a little bit older in style, probably passed down and used for many years. Even ceramics that tended to be of styles that were popular in the early 1800s. Again, things that could be passed down and continue to be used. But they also found pieces that were very trendy for the early 20th century. This is an early 20th century bowl that they found at the Eason House. So that shows that the people of Malaga had a few modern things. You know, they wanted to be stylish and contemporary with their neighbors. The archaeologists found hundreds and hundreds of pieces of clay pipes. So clay pipes were for recreational tobacco, smoking. And you would have, it's actually a really, really long stem. And you would smoke some, break it off, kind of just throw the end piece on the ground and then keep smoking. And so the archaeologists found hundreds of pieces of this. If you go to Malaga, you just see them on the surface still. The archaeologists found both textiles and fragments of shoes as well, which helped us to understand that the people of Malaga were really using things up until you couldn't use them anymore, and then they would throw them out. So all of this really helps to kind of paint more of a picture of how they were living. What was really, really important with all of this is that all the archaeological artifacts that the archaeologists found match what would have been in any coastal community in Maine. Not just an island community, not just a Black community, but any fishing community in Maine. So it's really showing that the people of Malaga lived just like their neighbors did. So who were the people of Malaga? This is actually a photograph of the Griffin house. The Griffins, Henry and Fatima Darling Griffin, she went by Tina, they were probably the first people to live on Malaga. Like I said, they started living there in around 1863. Henry was from the Branch area of Phippsburg. Tina had grown up on Bear Island. So when they married, they were looking for a place to set up home. Nobody was using Malaga. Nobody was on it. So they set up home on Malaga and started raising their family there. Henry, just like everybody else on Malaga, everybody in the Phippsburg area, fished and then did other work as well. It's sort of this ongoing theme in Maine, right? Is we all have 2 or 3 jobs. Well, so did they. You know, everybody on Malaga Island fished, men, women, children, everybody. And then they would do other work as well. Living next to them were the McKinneys. Jim McKinney was a white gentleman from Phippsburg. He married Salome Griffin. So that's sort of that family connection, you know, cousin, you know, moving in. They built their house next to the Griffins. And it was actually considered the best house on Malaga. It's a nice 2-room cape. And it was considered the largest, the best home on the island. Jim McKinney and Salome actually had the first recorded child on the island. So Louisa McKinney, who later became Louisa McKinney Murphy, she's actually the first recorded birth on Malaga. And I'm careful to say that she's the first recorded birth, only because she's the first birth certificate that we have. Doesn't necessarily mean she's the first baby to show up on Malaga, because in the 1800s, not everybody was filing a birth with the town office. So she's the first recorded birth that we know of. She grew up on Malaga Island, raised, actually ended up getting married and started raising her children there as well. Her dad, Jim McKinney, James Eli McKinney was his full name, was often referred to as the king of Malaga Island. So for Malaga, and for many fishing communities, whoever's sort of the best fisherman becomes sort of a spokesperson for the community and a bit of a leader. And so Jim McKinney served that role for the people of Malaga. He was considered the best fisherman. He was certainly a spokesperson for the community in that if you look through newspaper articles of the time period, he is by far the person who's quoted the most out of any of the residents. My own personal theory, and I have no documentation for this whatsoever, so I always kind of preference that. But my own personal theory is that he's also quoted the most because he's the white guy on the island. So more than likely, the newspaper reporters were most comfortable speaking with him. They actually featured his obituary in 1916 in the Lewiston paper, and they described him as a character who lived on the pristine Isle of Malaga. And they described him as someone that all the people of the island would actually bring their troubles to him and he would solve them. They also made sure to highlight his skill at fiddle playing. I guess he traveled up and down the New Meadows River performing with the fiddle at various resorts and summer communities in the area. Living near them and on the island was the last family that the archaeologists dug at, which is John Eason and his family. John, who you see here, just like everyone else, was a fisherman. He actually grew up in Bath. He was originally had the last name Shepherd, but ended up being adopted. So he grew up in Bath, married Rosella Griffin, and they settled on Malaga Island. This is his wife, Rosella. What I love about this picture is it's hard to see, but this is actually a detail of this larger picture. And until we had scanned in to really see the people and their faces, we were able to discover that she's holding their pet cat. Because don't we all love to be pictured with our pets? Yeah, well, so did they. So she was very proudly holding their pet cat. So they married, they lived in this house on Malaga, you know, a 1-room house. They lived there with about 8 people. I point that out because it's very, very similar to a home that the Phippsburg Historical Society is now restoring and caring for, the Murphy House, actually, which is pretty much the same setup. And it was a home of a large family in 1 room, and it really shows how common this was for fishing communities. This was a typical fishing family lifestyle in the 1800s and early 1900s. The other amazing thing about this photo, and I'm going to quiz you a little bit, because that's always fun, right? But the amazing thing about this photo is that we know a lot about it. This is actually a glass plate negative that's in the collection of the Maine State Museum in Augusta. It was taken by a photographer out of Gardner, Maine, named Herman Bryant. And he, because it was a glass plate negative, he kept it stored in a paper sleeve so it wouldn't get scratched or anything. But he did us a favor, and on the paper sleeve, he wrote the date that he took the photo. So we know he took this in July of 1911. We know that just a week before he took this photo, the newspapers had reported that Maine's Attorney General had decided that someone else owned Malaga Island, not the people who lived there. That it actually belonged to the Perry family, which was a family in Phippsburg, who had held the last title. They hadn't been using the island, they hadn't paid taxes on it, but they held the last title. So the Attorney General had decided someone else owned the island. And then this photographer comes out, tells them to pose in front of their house and take their picture. So the people that you see here know that the state's decided someone else owns their island. What they don't know is just 11 days after this photo was taken, the state announces that they're going to purchase the island and evict everyone. So this photo is actually taken in this really, really small window where the residents of Malaga Island know someone else owns their island, but they don't yet know what's going to happen. So it's a little window into their life. The other reason that I love this photo is that it actually debunks a whole bunch of the myths that were told about Malaga, just in this one photo. So one of the myths was that everyone on Malaga Island lived in tar paper shacks. What do you see? Biscuit siding, right? Not tar paper. It also has glass in the windows. Another one of the myths was that the people of Malaga had no way to heat their homes or cook their food. There's a chimney. So that doesn't really make sense, right? That doesn't quite add up. Another one of the myths is that they had no way to feed themselves. Except what does a penned-in fence usually mean? Animals. Maybe you have some stock. Archaeologists also found that that little area right in front of the house with the low fence is where they had a small vegetable garden. The last part is that one of the myths is that the people of Malaga had no way and no knowledge of how to clean or care for themselves. What's in the back? It's their laundry, which tells me they are cleaning. They're caring for themselves. So what I love about that, and what I use this a lot when I talk to school groups and students, is that you may be told one thing, but if you stop and look, and you stop and think, even with something as simple as one picture, you can really stop to wonder if what I'm being told is true. Does it really match up with what I'm seeing? Unfortunately, that didn't happen enough for the people of Malaga Island. And there's many, unfortunately, different reasons for it. So let's explore that a little bit. I will share that I am a firm believer that in history, there's rarely one really clear, easy answer for anything that happened. There's usually many things happening at once that cause an event. And for the people of Malaga Island, I think that was really true. You know, as I said, the people of Malaga started living there in 1863. And everyone knew it. Everyone was interacting with them. But by the late 1800s, early 1900s, the economy of Maine started to change. We saw a huge decline in the need for our timber, and certainly in the need for the beautiful wooden ships that were built in coastal Maine. There was a huge drop in the demand for shipbuilding because America was moving more towards railroads or metal steamships. So the shipyards in Phippsburg and Bath and all of the coastal area started to close. You just didn't need wooden ships in that same way. So when the shipyards close, guess what else closes? All the support industries. You don't need sails, you don't need ropes, you don't need as many barrels. You don't need as much of the material and the industry that was supporting most of the people of Maine at the time, especially on coastal Maine. So we saw all these people losing their jobs. At the same time that that was happening, there was also a decline in the amount of fish that was available. And so there was a lot more competition amongst the fishing communities. Now, when communities at that time in the early 20th century, if you needed some help to pay your bills, get some heating fuel, whatever, now you can apply to the state. Those programs didn't exist in Maine or really most of America at the time. So if you needed financial assistance, you applied to your town and your town would take care of you. And so that's what the people of Malaga Island did. You know, there was less money coming in. They applied to the town of Phippsburg for some help, just to pay for some of the grocery bills or to pay some of the medical bills. What's really key, because that became a big focus and a big reason that the state used to get more involved with the island. What's really important to remember, though, is that Malaga Island was not the only island community applying for financial help. Most of the people of Phippsburg were applying for financial help. Everyone needed a little bit of assistance. It's just that the island community was a distinct, controlled, mixed race community that could be seen as different. So the first thing that Phippsburg did was in 1903, Phippsburg actually applied to the state legislature because they didn't want to be financially responsible for the people of Malaga. So Phippsburg applied to the state legislature and said, you know, we don't think Malaga is actually in our town boundary. We think that Malaga belongs to Harpswell. And so Harpswell is responsible for them. The legislature fortunately said, no, nice try. They're definitely in your town boundaries. But I think they got some attention because in 1905, the state went in and they made the people of Malaga wards of the state. So that meant that the people of Malaga were now under the direct care of the state, who would make all decisions over their paying any of their bills, their medical treatment, anything that they needed, now went through the state. Now, the way that the state of Maine worked at the time, we had a governor, but we also had an executive council. We had the legislature and the judicial branch and all that. But the governor and the executive council were running the day-to-day business of state government. We had an executive council until 1976, actually. But that executive council kept track of every single little decision that they made. So that meant that all of this decision-making to make the people wards of the state, all of their bills, all of their requests, all of their grocery receipts, their medical bills are all kept in the records of the Executive Council of Maine. And so that's how I was able to piece together so much more of how these folks lived, because it actually was written down and kept. While all of this is going on and the state's becoming involved, America sees the rise in the eugenics movement. So eugenics was a scientific theory, a scientific belief that all of society's problems, any behaviors that were not seen as acceptable, were actually passed down through the genes of a family and could therefore be controlled if you could control those genes. If you could break up a family, if you could sterilize people, then you would get rid of illiteracy or alcoholism or theft or anyone living an immoral lifestyle. Eugenicists also termed the phrases like idiot, imbecile, moron. These actually became medical terms that were applied to people deemed to have low intelligence. So these are actual medical diagnoses that we now use commonly in our language, but they would actually be put on someone's medical chart and used as a justification to institutionalize them. This chart that you see here is the eugenics chart for the Marks family of Malaga Island. This is where the state was tracing the Marks, and that feeble-mindedness gene is what they called it. So everywhere that you see a black square or a black circle with an F in it, that's where they deem someone to be feeble-minded. And they're trying to trace it down through the family. While this is going on and starting to be applied as people are thinking of Malaga Island, the island actually made contact with, or was contacted by, two missionaries from Malden, Massachusetts, George and Lucy Lane. In 1906, the Lanes actually bought a home on Horse Island, that original island owned by Benjamin Darling, right near Malaga. They bought a summer home there. And then George Lane actually wrote to a friend saying, in looking for a project, I found what I was looking for on Malaga Island. So they decided that their project would be to work with the people of Malaga. I should actually say their project was to work with the women and children of Malaga. They seem to never mention the men. but they wanted to teach the women and children a middle-class style of living, is how they described it. Their first goal was to set up a school on Malaga, and they did it. In 1906, they started a school in one of the homes of the McKinney House. They had their daughter Cora serve as the first teacher, and the kids all eagerly attended. They wanted school. They wanted to get an education. So by 1907, when this picture was taken, the Lanes actually had to move their school to the larger room of the McKinney House just to accommodate the amount of kids who were there. The Lanes then very quickly realized that they could do more. And so they started fundraising efforts to build a schoolhouse on Malaga Island. They had worked with the state. The state agreed that if you build a schoolhouse, we will send a teacher to spend summers out there and work with the community. So the Lanes did that. The Lanes spent a lot of time and a lot of effort writing letters, writing articles in newspapers, visiting wealthy philanthropists in Portland and Boston and New York, raising money. But in doing so, they were also saying, hey, there's this community on Malaga Island. They can't care for themselves and they need our help. Won't you give us money to do it? They actually created a scrapbook, which is held in the collection of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, which they used as a fundraising tool. And the scrapbook had, little pastings of all the articles that showed up in newspapers and things. But it also had letters from the children, to the Lane saying, thank you for your help. Can I read to you? Things like that. They also had photos in there, which show they used it to show their work, I should say. There's a photograph on one page. There's a photograph of one little girl standing in a doorway, and she's looking very sad. She's looking really scruffy, and her dress is sort of torn and dirty, and she's not wearing any shoes. And underneath that, they wrote, Abby as she was. Then the photo right below that is the same little girl with her hair combed. She's all cleaned up. She's got a nice new dress. She's wearing shoes. She's smiling. And it says, Abby as she is now. So it was their way of showing, look at the work we can do. Help us do this. And they succeeded. They built a schoolhouse on Malaga Island. The state sent a teacher out to work with the community. The school was actually so popular that one child from the mainland paid tuition and would actually row over to the island to attend. So it was successful. The Phippsburg Historical Society has some fabulous school books from the schoolhouse. So we know that they learned geography, some literature, some math. This is actually a letter from Abby Tripp, one of the kids on Malaga, to Mrs. Lane, saying, when will you come visit? Can I read to you when you come? And then she signs it at the bottom with the little X's, that all girls used to sign their letters with. So they learned, they definitely got an education. While the Lanes were doing their work, the state was continuing theirs. Remember, the people of Malaga were wards of the state. The state was overseeing their care. In order to do that, the state actually appointed an agent. George Pease, who was a prominent, well-respected man in Phippsburg, acted as the state's agent. And he would go out to the island. He would check in on the people. He would pay their grocery bills, their medical bills, and correspond back to the state government as to what they needed. In 1911, he also corresponded back to the governor and the executive council with this report. This is actually only the last 2 pages. There's many more pages before this that are actually so disturbingly racist that I don't show them. They are available on our website, though, if you want to see them. He goes through and he describes all of the people on Malaga. He describes their race, very first thing. He then describes his opinion on their intelligence level or their work ethic. And then he goes down family by family this way. The last 2 pages are his recommendations on what should happen to Malaga Island and the people who live there. You can actually see the first page says, suggestions made by Agent Pease. State should own island. It could then prevent people from settling there and turn off the undesirable ones. He then goes through and suggests, you know, you can order this family here, you can order this family there. He actually says that the state could institutionalize some of them, like the Marks family or Mrs. Annie Parker, who was an older woman who lived on the island, that the state could put them in the newly opened school for the feeble-minded because they are fit subjects. He also, at the bottom of that first page, suggests that the state could send Lizzie Marks's child, 2.5 years old, to Mrs. Hunt at Portland. She wants the child. On the last page, he actually says that there's a few older people on the island that the state could just leave there because they'll die soon anyways. And then at the end, he says that the state should purchase the island from the Perry family and receive good title and therefore prevent anyone from coming back. And I think what's really, really important about this report is that it shows how the people of Malaga Island were being viewed by state government. They were not viewed as people. They were not viewed as individuals, but they were viewed as a problem, and a problem that had to be dealt with. Agent Pease definitely got attention with his report because very soon after, Mrs. Hunt, that Mrs. Hunt in Portland who wanted the child, well, that's Augusta Hunt. She was a very prominent, wealthy woman in Portland who'd been working with the Lanes and sending money to them. She actually wrote to the Lanes to let them know that the governor and his executive council would soon be visiting the island. And please don't tell the people of Malaga, because I wouldn't want them cleaned up and I wouldn't want conditions to look better than they are. And don't worry, you can answer all of the governor's questions for them. They won't need to talk to him at all. So again, that's not even the state perspective. That's a philanthropist who is working on behalf of the people and helping the people. But she's helping them by saying, we're going to send the governor. Don't tell them that he's coming. I don't know about you, but if the governor came to visit my house, I'd kind of want to know. Not be wearing, you know, my pajamas, maybe make sure my sink is clean. I don't have dirty dishes everywhere. But they weren't given that chance. And instead, the governor and his executive council did visit Malaga Island. This is actually a photo postcard made of the landing of Governor Frederick Plaisted and his council on Malaga. It was such a deal, a big deal, that they made a photo postcard of it and it was sold nationwide. After that visit, Governor Plaisted reported, the Times Record newspaper reported, he said that the best plan would be to burn down the shacks with all their filth. Certainly the conditions are not credible to our state and we ought not to have such things near our front door. And I do not think a like condition could be found in Maine, although there are some pretty bad localities elsewhere. His executive council then devoted a whole section of Malaga Island to their annual report for that year. The council said, there has been heretofore, and some are existing at the present time, certain pauper colonies that for years have been a disgrace to the adjacent communities and a blot upon the state. And Malaga Island was one of them. They also said that after viewing conditions, it was decided at a council meeting shortly after, this is an amazing quote, that the good of the state and the cause of humanity demanded that the colony be broken up and the people segregated. It was decided that to rid the island of its population and to prevent further squatting, the state should hold title to the property. And that became the official decision of the Executive Council. That's exactly what they did. In December of 1911, the state of Maine purchased Malaga Island from the Perry family for $471. They then ordered the people of Malaga Island to be off the island by July 1st, 1912. A few of the families were given a small amount of money, like $50 or $100. None of them were given a place to go, land or a house or any other place to go. They just said you had to be out. Then the state went so far as to give them reasons not to come back. In what I love about this story, this is the one thing I actually love about this story. is that on July 1st, 1912, when the state showed up, the sheriff, Agent Pease, showed up to forcibly evict everyone on Malaga. They were ready to drag them out, burn the houses down. What they found was that everyone on Malaga had already left. And not only had they left, they took their houses with them. There was nothing left. And what I love about that is for a group of people who had no voice and no power and no opportunity to really try to fight this, they at least controlled the one thing that they could control. They could control how and when they left. And so that's what they did. After they left, the state actually exhumed the cemetery, exhumed any of the bodies from the cemetery, and then decided to sell the island. So that by December of 1912, they asked for bids for the island. They received 12 bids and they sold it to the highest bidder for $1,650. So the state actually owned Malaga Island for only a year. In doing so, like I said, they had exhumed the cemetery just before they sold the island. So they sold it in December. In November, they exhumed all the bodies. What they did was they exhumed 17 bodies and sent them all to the cemetery at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. What they actually did was combine those 17 bodies into 5 caskets. And we actually have the burial book at the state archives as well that shows who's buried in which plot. So 8 people are in plot 11, 3 in plot 12, and so it goes. The Marks family were particularly devastated by this eviction. Before the actual eviction, in December of 1911, a doctor who was a member of the executive council and the sheriff went out and held sort of a mock trial for the Marks family. Gave them a brief intelligence test, met with all of them, and sent them all to the newly opened Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. They were deemed to be feeble-minded. The men and women went to separate dormitories. The family was completely broken up. This is the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, West Pownell, New Gloucester, right on the town line there, commonly known today as Pineland. So when you go and hike the beautiful trails, I mean, the site is absolutely gorgeous. But that's how it started. It was actually as the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. And so that's where they were sent. Abby and Lottie Marks were the only 2 members of the Marks family who were ever released from Malaga. All the other members of the family died there. At the state archives, we actually have the client files for the Marks family from their time at Pineland, at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. And Abby's file actually states that she was released because she was no longer of childbearing age, so she was no longer seen to be a threat to the community. Lottie was released because she befriended a nurse who advocated for her release. And so they actually did, after several years of efforts, they released her. Both Abby and Lottie moved to Bath, where they worked as housekeepers in homes here. Jake, Abby's husband, died after entering the school pretty quickly. I think he probably was sick when he went in. Their son, James, died just a few months after as well. Etta and Lizzie, their daughters, made it until the 1920s before they passed away at the institution. And then Willie Marks, who you see listed at the bottom, that's that child of Lizzie Marks, the child that the state, Agent Pease was recommending be sent to Mrs. Hunt. They didn't actually send him to Mrs. Hunt, and instead at the age of 3, he entered the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, where he spent the rest of his life and died there at the age of 19. Lottie, one who was released, lived until the age of 103. She died in 1997. Like I said, she lived for many years in Bath. She then lived in Brunswick. She's actually buried in Brunswick. She always wanted to be buried in on Malaga, but that didn't happen. She would often talk about Malaga Island with very fond memories of growing up there and the kids all dancing and singing and everybody fishing in this very tight community. She always talked about having Native American ancestry, never talked about having African American ancestry. That became a really common story that was told amongst descendants. And she, to her dying day, denied ever being at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. She also married twice and never had children. It was really common for people who had been at Pineland to either not acknowledge their residency there, or for their family to not acknowledge connection as well. Because of course, with that eugenics belief, if it's passed down through genes and a member of your family is deemed to be feeble-minded, it's assumed maybe you would be as well. So people stopped talking about it. Other residents of Malaga Island really scattered to nearby towns. This is John Eason, living in Cundy's Harbor in 1934. If you remember, John was the one pictured standing in front of his house with his wife and 2 grandkids, and his wife was holding their pet cat. Obviously, pets are still very important to them because he has his pet dog very proudly. The house behind him, though, is what I love, because I swear that is his house from Malaga, just rebuilt, you know, so that the door is on the other side. But that's probably the house that he took with him from the island and just reburied it in Cundy's Harbor. I mean, rebuilt it in Cundy's Harbor. So Malaga Island today is a nature preserve. It is owned by Maine Coast Heritage Trust. What's amazing about Malaga Island is even though the state sold it in 1912, the end of 1912, and it was bought by a private individual, it was actually owned by several different individuals over the decades. And amazingly, nobody ever built on the island. So the sites where the houses of this community, you know, are undisturbed sites. And for an African-American community, that is unheard of. That an archaeologist can dig at those sites and know that they're digging at the home of one family and no one else afterwards. So it's really quite fortunate that nobody built on the island afterwards. If you ask people in Phippsburg, it's because the island's cursed. It may be that as well. The state has actually taken some efforts to kind of make amends or at least recognize the actions of the state when it comes to the Malaga Island community. In 2010, Governor Baldacci was the first governor to set foot on Malaga Island. He actually landed and spoke to a group of gathered descendants. And I was very honored to be there that day because he just stepped off the island, greeted folks, and then spoke from the heart. He didn't have any prepared speech. He just looked at them all and said, "I am so sorry. Maine is better than this, and this never should have happened." And it was a very, very powerful, powerful day. It was a day that was many years in the making, actually. Gerald Talbot, who was Maine's first Black legislator, and his daughter, Rachel Talbot Ross, who is currently Maine's first Black Speaker of the House, they had actually spent years advocating with the state government, with governors, to issue an apology and recognize it. And it was Governor Baldacci who was the first governor to actually do it. When we opened the exhibit at the Maine State Museum in 2012, what we did was actually invite all of the descendants in to see the exhibit first before anyone else, so that they could really see their history and connect with it before the rest of Maine did. And so it was this amazing, amazing day where all these people were coming together to learn about their family history that had really been hidden from them for so long, but also to connect and meet with relatives that they had never known existed. So it kind of became this wonderful, wonderful event, bless you, and very awkward at the same time, because all of a sudden you're meeting all these people that you're related to, but you've never met them before. So it's kind of different. When we closed the exhibit in 2013, what we did is we closed it to the public and then held another gathering of the descendants so that they could be the last ones to see it. And that became like this amazing family reunion where they had spent the year getting to know each other and really connecting. And it was just much more of a celebration of them as a family. So it was wonderful. Some of us have continued that work. In 2017, we dedicated a memorial to the people of Malaga, which is at the Pineland Cemetery, where the people were moved to, the cemetery was moved to. That was actually mostly thanks to the efforts of Governor Paul LePage. He was there at the dedication. He was the largest funder for the memorial. And he really felt it was a story that needed to continue to be shared and documented. He also proposed the state's scholarship fund that the state set up for the descendants of Malaga Island. The state set aside about $300,000 to descendants, direct descendants of that eviction that could be used for scholarships. I was on that committee, and we were given 5 years to give away all of that money. And I'm really proud to say we did it in 3. We sent a lot of people to school, and it was wonderful. So if you want to learn more, there's a bunch more wonderful information that's available online, or some great books. Definitely check these out. I've also printed these out on some flyers in the back. So if you wanted to explore more and learn. And I definitely encourage you to visit the Maine State Archives website, because that's where you can see some of this original documents, you know, for yourself, and really read them for yourself. It was one of my first acts as state archivist, was to have all of the documents digitally imaged and put online, so that you could see them and you could really research and understand the history on your own. That's about it. Are there any questions? Yes.
Have you read the book by Paul Harding? His other.
I'm gonna laugh because I already talked about that earlier before the program with someone. I was like, you can go ahead and ask me that, because someone will.
The best book. What wonderful prose. Oh.
So I will be brutally honest, and it is a horribly offensive book that the descendants are very, very upset about, very much upset about. And I'm really bothered that it was ever even published, actually. And I'll tell you why. This is where, like, obviously I don't pull punches when it comes to this, because I think it's really wrong. So that book, Mr. Hardin, when he wrote it, and he's given lots of interviews stating this, that he vaguely heard the story, saw one picture online, and then very purposely stopped researching, because he didn't want the actual history to influence his writing. And I will note, you know, it is a fictional book, and it's very important to keep it in mind that it's a fictional book. The problem that I have with it, and I'm totally fine with a fictional book. The problem that I have with it is that it's a fictional book. At the beginning, he very clearly states it's based on the true story of Malaga Island. And then by doing no research, he wrote a story that has absolutely nothing to do with what the actual story of Malaga Island is. And he ended up perpetuating many of the myths. And I think and he did it, I'm sure, completely by mistake. He didn't know because he didn't do the research. But by not doing the research, he's continuing this conception for people who don't know the actual history, thinking that there was crime, there was murder, there was low intelligence. There's children who are only awake during the day and they're eating starfish and dirt. You know, that's kind of, and there's incest. He writes all of that into his book. All of those were the myths that were created and the state used to justify their actions, their institutionalization, their eviction. And so that's why I have a problem with that.
I wonder if anybody's challenging him on that.
Me? No. No, actually, he called into.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was on Maine calling. I called in. He wasn't. So a few of us are trying to get a little bit more attention to it. We have an amazing author in the back who's you know, really bothered by it as well, and would like to see more of the actual story told. But it's a matter of it's hard because he's already won, you know, very prestigious prizes in the past. So he gets a lot of attention, and so it's hard to kind of counter that. Yes.
Wasn't there any other island community that became a ward of the state in that time frame?
Not that I have found. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but not that I have found. Not where they took an entire island community. There were sometimes individual families that the state would do that with. Um,
Other communities inland in the state? So this is the only example.
for Maine, this is it. Yeah. Yes,
There's a document where there's talking about removing the people that you show this, talked about Frenchboro
yes,
and.
in Athens,
And we also grew up in Warren.
Yeah.
And there was a community called N Town.
Peterborough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where folks lived, you know,
Yeah.
were there more mixed race communities and?
There were several Black communities all over Maine. Warren actually had the largest Black population in all of Maine in 1850.
Wow.
So that was the largest concentration. But that's because of Peterborough, because it became a community where they were selling land to other Black families to give them a place to go. But there was Bangor, there was Portland, and then of course, well, you have Bath and Brunswick had their own Black neighborhoods. You know, Old Bath Road is where was kind of considered the Black part of town for Bath, and Brunswick. But it was in Maine, the overall population, the Black population in Maine, it's really important to keep in mind, and this is something Rachel Talbot Ross told me really early on. She's like, if you can just help people understand that Maine has a very long Black history and we haven't just arrived, she's like, that would be revolutionary for Maine. And it's true, because Black people have been in Maine since the 1620s. I mean, very, very early. They've always been here. Rachel Talbot Ross is a 9th generation Mainer, I believe. They've been here a very long time. But what tended to happen is you would have concentrations, communities within other towns, or you would have a family living here, a family living there, a family living there. So there was never such a large Black population in Maine that it was seen as a very powerful or overall very threatening community either, because the population numbers were small. My theory, my belief, is that Malaga Island stood out as different because it was a concentrated community on one island, but it wasn't just a Black community. It was a mixed race community. So it was Black people and white people living together, and that somehow seemed more threatening. Yes, in the back.
The question to ask the people, the presidents of Malaga Island, what did they have to find out if they were feeble? What did they ask for?
So they were given a Binet test, which was an intelligence test that was used across the nation to determine someone's intelligence level. And they would be asked things like, who's the president right now? Well, if you live on a rural island community, there wasn't a lot of people in Maine who could actually answer that question. Or they would be shown like a picture of a telephone. Again, if you live on a rural island community, you haven't seen a telephone yet. So it was things like that they would use to determine someone's intelligence level. Or it would really be as basic as an official in town who's familiar enough with them, who says, oh, I think they're feeble-minded. And that would be enough. Yes.
I'm wondering why, since this is such a unique and significant part of Maine's history, why the display at the State Museum wasn't a permanent one.
You'd have to ask the State Museum. I mean, I will say, you know, it was the space that was given for it was in the temporary gallery, and they had other exhibits scheduled and planned for it. The entire State Cultural Building right now, which is where the State Museum, the State Archives, and the State Library were all located, that building's been closed since 2020 for renovations. We had a complete catastrophic HVAC failure where there was no heat and no air conditioning, which for museum objects, people, records, it's not good. So we actually had to move out of that building, and that's not going to open until 2025. So that's part of it as well. Yes, question in the back.
You mentioned a source of one of the photographs. All the other photographs, especially the family one, who's taking those photos?
We actually don't know who took them, but almost all of them come from the collection of one Phippsburg resident. His name's Peter Roberts, amazing guy. He was a teacher, lobsterman, and his parents actually collected them. And so he kept them, and he has felt it's very important to share them. And I do think it's really, really helpful because I can talk to you like all the time. Like obviously I could talk about this for hours, but it's different when you can actually put a face to what I'm describing and you can see real people. Yes, Mary.
One of the pictures that you showed of the boats, I believe was taken originally by an Englishman. And I have no
Could be.
idea how he got to Phippsburg, but we got a query from England requesting permission from us to use that picture for a catalog that they were doing.
No,
It
interesting.
was very unusual, something we had never received at the Historical Society before or since. But I told them that, you know, we had no way to give them permission because
It's out of copyright.
we really owned it.
Yeah.
I mean, it had been given to us. But I thought it was interesting that an Englishman had come over here, somehow had heard about it and visited, you know, the island at that time.
Definitely. So Mary's with the Phippsburg Historical Society, and it's an amazing place, a really good resource to learn more about Malaga. But not only that, but Malaga as part of the Phippsburg community as well. And I will say, I'm not totally surprised that an Englishman, you know, a photographer may have heard of Malaga, because it was in newspapers nationwide. I found it in newspapers in Utah, where they were reprinting articles about Malaga Island. In 1908, Harper's Magazine, which was the most popular magazine of the time, like worldwide popular, in 1908, they printed an article called "The Queer Folk of the Maine Coast." And they talked about these island people and how odd they were, as they put it. And of course, a huge feature of that was Malaga Island. So yes, on the floor.
Can't remember where I read that, but there were some stories of the state burning some of the homes to avoid having any of the inhabitants to return. Did that happen, or because he didn't mention?
Yeah, no, they actually didn't end up having to burn the houses. The residents really took all of their homes with them. The state did exhume the cemetery, and then the schoolhouse, which is the one thing that, you know, the island residents hadn't built, so they left that. What the state did is they sold that to Louds Island, where it was dismantled and rebuilt as the chapel at Louds Island, and it's still there. So, but they definitely cleaned it out, removed anything that they could to not give, you know, make sure that people didn't have a reason to come back. Yes.
We have a question from Zoom.
Oh yeah, please.
Someone on Zoom asked, what is the origin of the name Malaga?
Oh, so this is a fabulous question that I don't have an answer to, but everyone asks every time, except you are all the very first to hear. This afternoon, I stumbled on, there is a town in Washington State called Malaga, Washington. I was like, that is just strange. What a coincidence. It's named after the Malaga grape. It's a type of grape. And I wonder, this is all new, literally like as of 3 hours ago. I wonder if there's some sort of connection with that. You know, I've always thought that it has to do with Malaga, Spain in some way, because Phippsburg's a trading port. We know that Maine ships were going to Malaga, which was another major trading port. So if it had something to do with that, but that's also where the name of this grape comes, is from Malaga, Spain. So I'm wondering if there's some sort of connection there. No idea. New theory I'm playing with here. Yes.
I may not be alone, but I'm one of the people in the room who was trained as an archivist.
Yeah.
And one of the questions is, what the heck does an archivist do?
Yeah.
I just want to thank you for showing exactly what archivists do.
Yeah. Thank you. We do get that question a lot, don't we? It's like archivists, what is that? Yes, without a doubt. Yes.
I have a question about comparable or similar things that might happen or have happened in other states. I know
Yes.
many states have institutions for people being feeble-minded and did horrific things to their citizens. And I'm wondering whether you or the State Archives office have connected with some of these folks and have attempted to kind of weave a story about the first part of the 20th century when a lot of this stuff was going on.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Maine certainly is not the only state that had a school for the feeble-minded. We were one of many, many. We were not the first one either. The first one opened up in New Jersey. We have not really connected with them a lot. yet, I would say. Part of it is, as I am connecting with other states, it's been really interesting to learn what the confidentiality restrictions are around access to client records. And it's really the client records that tell you about the treatment and the process and how people were viewed, what their life was like in the institution. In so many other states, those are locked down, and state archives are desperately fighting to try to make them more available so that people can learn more about the treatments of individuals there. Maine, we're very lucky in that we have part of the statute, that the law that controls the Maine State Archives, which says that any record that comes to the archives, it comes as confidential, it stays as confidential until it reaches 75 years. Once it reaches 75 years, I can open it and share it. And with that, well, at least we do have that time frame to work within, but with that, we can open up and share so much more than other states, actually. I've had a lot of states writing to me saying, can you share that language? Because I really want to bring that to my attorney general and try to get that in place, because it goes more from the perspective that we are preserving these records so that they can be opened and shared, while trying to balance someone's individual privacy at the same time. As opposed to saying, we have these records, but we should always hide them because we're embarrassed by them. So it's a very different approach. Yeah. Anything else from Zoom? No? All right. Mary? Yeah.
Last thing.
Yeah.
We had a graduate student doing research at the Phippsburg Historical Society. And in talking to Kate, she found out that the Historical Society had a record that we should not have had because it wasn't 75 years old. So Kate sent me an email and asked me to destroy it, which was—
It was a copy of one that we had.
It was very difficult for me to do it.
Yeah.
But, you know, legally, etc., I needed to destroy it. So I took it home and burned it. So we no longer have that one particular record, even though we have 13 reminders.
Yeah.
Of information about Malaga.
And this is where Maine is fabulous, because we really are a small community. And I know Mary, and I could just shoot her an email and say, hey, you shouldn't have that. And I know that she'll actually destroy it when I ask. And she knows to trust me to be like, okay, I really shouldn't have it, you know? So it's wonderful that way. Yes, last question.
I have a question about Agent Pease you mentioned.
George Pease.
Was there any additional research done there? Like, we always say, oh, the government did this. These are individuals, these are humans, these are people, they have their own stories. Did you find anything about Agent Pease?
You know, I haven't dug into him nearly as much. But Mary, do you guys know more about George Pease? Because he was really prominent in the town.
I can tell you a couple things about George Pease. He weighed about 300 pounds. He was a blacksmith who worked out of a blacksmith shop that was right where Bisson's store is now in Phippsburg. He lived across the street from that. And when we have one school, Mount Desert, that comes every year. There's a one school in Maine that comes to find out more about Malaga. And one of the interesting things I realized in talking to those students, right around the Phippsburg Historical Society, which was a one-room school, 3 of the major people in the eviction lived. One was Dr. Williams, who lived in the Spite House, which is another fascinating story, which moved by barge to Rockport. Dr. Williams there is still a journal that he kept with some of the patients from Malaga that he had. The other one, the second one, was the selectman, Charles Minot Jr., who lived in the 1774 house, which is just beyond the Historical Society, and between that and the Congregational Church. And the third person who, besides George Pease, Charles Minot Jr., the selectman, and Dr. Williams, all lived in just a few steps away from each other. And it's so interesting when the kids come from Mount Desert that they go to the church And the minister allows them to go up on the pulpit and look down at where these three men would have sat in church during church services. So it's a really interesting spot in Phippsburg history that is on the other side of the peninsula than Malaga, but is directly related in that one little section of town.
Thank you for that.
All right, I am going to stop sharing for those on Zoom. Thank you.
Thanks. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you all for being here. Just a reminder that we have the survey at the back of the room and that this is the first of a 3-part series. So our next event, we're going to be going a little bit further back in time and talking about Maine's role in the Underground Railroad. And then we'll be bringing it back to Malaga with our state poet laureate who has written a collection of poems about the island. So we do have flyers in the back of the room at a table and then right outside the door as well. And my contact information is on there. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But thank you all for being a part of this and for being here.